Good to hear. I always enjoy two things in congregations. One, congregations that are hard to get settled down, because it means we got something to talk about, and I appreciate that. And this congregation has always had that problem. The second one is crying babies. We've talked about that often. Whenever I hear a crying baby, I think, okay, that congregation's got some life. We have a lot of life in this congregation and a lot more coming. So there's a lot of crying babies and a lot more on their way, and that's a great sound. Yeah, it's better than hearing grumpy old men like me. I'd like to thank everyone for being here this morning. We are beginning in a new quarter, and this quarter is actually a little bit different. We do this every year in our congregation, have done for several years now. Really looking forward to this quarter every time, and that's what I don't know what the official title is. We end up making it up into something. I call it the Different Speakers Quarter. But basically, for the next 13 classes, we're going to be covering different subjects out of the book by, his name is John Gazzetta. I think that's right, yeah. And it's called Unsung Heroes by John Gazzetta, 25 minor characters in the New Testament. And so what we've done is we've gotten men who a lot of times haven't necessarily been the primary teachers in the auditorium, or maybe not gotten an opportunity to. We've left the sign up open to all the men of the congregation to sign up for one of the lessons, to take on a lesson about one of these unsung heroes or unsung characters of the Bible. And so when we cover this, each Sunday you're going to get a different teacher tackling one of these lessons. And the lesson material is actually in a book that we've got. I think we've got some copies digitally that were sent out, that Danny sent out through email, and tried to get everyone connected through that. If you have an email address on the website, you probably got a copy. But if you didn't, we're also going to send it out through band, and then after that, it's your responsibility to come to us if we don't know how to get a hold of you. But if you don't get a copy, we'll try to get one to you. Today, we won't be using the class material that's in the book, but we'll be talking about the character of Archippus. Everyone knows Archippus. Everyone knows all about him because he's one of the, we don't know anything about Archippus, do we? Not hardly at all. Some of you are like, Archippus, who's that? And that's the whole point of this. And as we go through these lessons, and each of the men has these, it's a little bit challenging in one way, I'll tell you, to cover a character like this, because there's 17 words written to Archippus in the New Testament. And that's all we have. We have nothing historical. There's no third-party writings. There's nothing else ever mentioned about him historically that we can find ever. And so Archippus is a very limited character in that way. But I'll tell you this, sometimes, people talk about the more narrow the subject, sometimes the harder it is to keep your lesson under control. I had 14 pages of notes on Archippus. That's a page, a little under a page per word. And so there's a lot of lessons and depth in Archippus's interaction with Paul and with God that I want to cover today. And so I'm looking forward to the other men and their lessons and what they have to present as we go on. And so there's only 17 words, but a lot of lessons, and we're going to cover some of those today. So we're going to start with our source text in just a moment, but I'm going to ask one of the men to lead us in a prayer before we do that. And I'm sorry I didn't get with one of you before. First one to make eye contact is Jordan. All right, so Jordan, if you don't mind to lead us in a prayer, and then we'll start with our source text. Amen. Thank you. All right, and I'm going to need a reader, and I apologize. I'm going to put up everything that we know about Archippus on one screen, and I hope you can read it all. So we're going to read both of these passages. Can I get a reader for them? All right, Robert, thank you.
Say to Archippus, see that you fulfill the ministry that you have received in the Lord. To Philemon, our beloved fellow worker, and Apphia, our sister, and Archippus, our fellow soldier, and the church in your house.
Okay, and in Philemon 2, I actually included a few extra words from verse 1 just to give it context, but that wasn't written to Archippus. So this is what we know about Archippus, is what's contained in these 2 verses. But I'm going to tell you that I think that there's a lot more to it, and you're going to see that kind of my take on it as we go. One of the things I wanted to ask you before we go any further, and I'm sure you guys read the same verses I sent out, here's your source text, read this for Sunday. And as you read these, I want to get your feeling, just a gut feeling. What do you think? What is kind of your, I'll ask, does Archippus have a positive or negative vibe to you? Positive? Okay, I think that's fair. There's some people online that write about him out of these words and go, I don't know, I think he was kind of lazy because he needed to be reminded of his ministry, that type of thing. I don't agree with that. I think that we can take a real positive vibe. I think the idea that he's called a fellow soldier by Paul kind of overrides any question about his other comment that he makes in Colossians about fulfilling his ministry. I do think that there's something there. And we're going to talk about that, but I was curious to get your take on him as we kind of develop through the lesson here. And if you change your mind on that, let me know. But I think that I agree with generally what you guys are saying, that is positive. So remember when I said this was everything we knew about Archippus? Tell me some things we can know about Archippus. What are some things from these 2 verses that you can tell me that you know about him? Okay, that would be Philemon, but yeah, maybe it was his home as well. Yeah. It's hard to tell. I think it was to Philemon specifically, but I tend to think that the theory is that Philemon and Apphia were husband and wife, and Archippus might be their son or maybe Philemon's brother. And I think that's reasonable to think, but there was a church in their home. I think that's reasonable, yeah, like that. Yeah, Tricia?
He was well known to Paul.
Well known to Paul. Paul, he was no stranger. He speaks friendly and knowledgeable about. Paul knew him, right? Okay, buddy?
The fellow soldier, that tells us a lot.
Yeah, I think so.
Because, I mean, you do the whole lesson on if you're a fellow soldier, these countless things apply to you. Christian life, faithfulness.
Yeah, we know he's a Christian, right, at least. At the very least, we know he's a Christian, and we know that he was known as a soldier, a fellow soldier. So that gives us some clues into that. Jordan?
You pointed out when I taught Philemon, there were 2 schools of thought for Archippus. One is that he's Philemon's son. The other is that he may be the evangelist there in Colossae or in Philemon's house.
Yeah, that's another question, of course, is he has a ministry, right? So what role does he serve? Is he an elder? Is he a preacher? Is he a teacher? What is he? We don't really know that, do we? But we're indicated that there's some role that he plays and some indication that he has some interaction with the church there, and it's positive, right? So we can learn quite a few things. One thing that we can learn that we might think of more on it's not negative, but it's on the reinforcing side, is he needed a reminder, didn't he? Or an encouragement, maybe you tell him. You know, you say, you need a reminder, you need an encouragement of that. So what we don't know about him is his position in the church. Do you guys have an indication of his age? Would you say he was maybe 16? Don't really get that feeling, right? Because Paul knew him well, and he had established himself with Paul. He knew about him and knew who he was. So there's some time apart there, so probably not like 16. But you don't really know from that point onward. He could have been just about any age. We don't really know that. We don't know what his ministry was and what exactly he was supposed to do to fulfill it. We don't really know that. We know that he knew it. He understood what Paul was telling him about, but we don't know that. So let me ask you this as a follow-up then. Was this everything that was ever known about Archippus contained here? No. No, as we already pointed out, Paul knew more, right? Paul knew more than what he said here. He knew more about him. Who else knew more? God knew more, right? These are Paul's words through God. God chose Paul to say these words to Archippus. So we know that God took note of Archippus and wrote these words through Paul to be connected to him. Do you think the Christians at Colossae knew him? Yeah, I think it's very clear that he being at Colossae and having a ministry, being in the household of Philemon one way or another, that's where the church met, was in the household of Philemon. So he was associated with the church in Colossae. The congregation there knew him and probably knew well of him. And it looks like it's in a positive way in everything that we know. So what do we know about God and Archippus then from that conclusion? And I would say, well, what we do know is that God took time. The Holy Scriptures have a certain number of words that God allotted. Probably before the foundation of time, he knew how many words he was going to allot to give us in guidance. And he chose 17 words for this guy who never made a splash on the Christian scene worldwide. He was not a Peter. He wasn't a Paul. He wasn't anything like that. And yet he chose 17 words to be written to him, to be preserved through time for us to read about Archippus. God knew Archippus. And even though Archippus wasn't a big player in the New Testament, Archippus was important. And his ministry was important, and what he was doing was important. And to remind everyone of that, and to bring that to the first lesson that I want to get from it, and that is the idea that sometimes we can feel like an Archippus in the work of the kingdom, can't we? Especially in the situation that we're in. We're not headliners and things like that. We're people who work in the church and work in the kingdom, and sometimes we can feel invisible in that work. We can feel unnoticed in that work. And in this section, I wanted to bring up to you that I think that there's one particular subgroup of Christians, and I changed this yesterday, actually. I changed the focus of this point. I think there's one particular subgroup of Christians that particularly feels unnoticed sometimes in the kingdom, that feels invisible in the kingdom. Can you guess who maybe I'm talking about? I'm asking about women. Women working in the kingdom sometimes, and I know this because I have a wife, and I think it's just realistic, because their work goes kind of in the background. There's a quietness to the work of Christian women that I think that makes them sometimes feel invisible or feel unnoticed in that. The role of mothers, caretakers, preparing meals, writing cards, praying, encouraging, opening their homes, all of these things happen kind of in the background. And we don't see them in that way. Well, you know what all of these ladies have in common? What all those actions have in common? Is you're never going to read about any of those things in the church bulletin. You're never going to see a name attributed in Facebook to what a lady did in her work in the kingdom. We're never going to put a sign out front or send out flyers telling everyone that a Christian woman is coming to town to quietly do her work in the kingdom. We're not going to do that, are we? It's just not going to happen. It's not, it's not something we do. And so it's easy sometimes, I think, for Christian ladies to think that what their work is invisible. And it is, in fact, unnoticed. But I want to tell you from the point of Archippus and from the point of the Colossian church and the point of this church, we want to talk today a little bit about why that's not true. That's just truly not true, and it is actually noticed, and it is appreciated, and it is eternally important, the work that women do in doing that. I want to read a verse to you here when it comes in 1 Corinthians. And I apologize, these are small. Hopefully it's a little bigger up here. Can I get a reader for 1 Corinthians chapter 1, buddy, if you don't mind? Thank you.
For consider your calling, brothers. Not many of you were wise according to worldly standards. Not many were powerful. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, even things that are not, to bring to nothing things that are, so that no human being might boast in the presence of God.
Okay, this is actually a really complicated verse. It has a lot of language that kind of folds in on itself and repeats, but then repeats in a different way. I want to focus in on verses 27 and 28 there. I'm going to reread that to you just to focus in on those two. But God chose what is foolish in the world, to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, even the things that are not, to bring to nothing things that are. When Paul says these words through God, and he says the things that are low and despised, who is he talking about? He started off by saying, not a lot of you came from noble upbringing. Not a lot of you came from important runnings in life. You're kind of like the bottom rung of society. He says, but God chose the low and the despised. Who is he talking about? That's all of us, yeah, folks. You're the low. In the world's eyes, you're the despised. You are the lower than low. The world doesn't like us. The world is not impressed with Christians. If you haven't figured that out by now, you haven't been on this world for very long. We're not impressive to the world. The world looks at us and just scoffs. We're flyover people. We don't matter in the world in the big scheme of things. We really aren't that important. And that's what the world says. But here's the thing that I wanted to ask, to make the point out of this, though, is that let me tell you something else, though, is ladies, you are especially not impressive to the world. You are not. The world, when Paul makes that point up there and he says the things that are low and despised in the world, and then he goes one step further. He said, even the things that are not. You know what that phrase is? Think of the word not, N-A-U-G-H-T. The things that are unknown. They're not even known. It's like they don't think enough of you to despise you. You don't even exist in their eyes. And I think a lot of times, ladies, to the world, I think that's where you live in the world. The world looks at you and says, I don't even know what you're doing or why you choose to do it and why it's important to you. And they look at that. But I want to take the lesson from this that I want to ask you the question first. Let me ask you this. What does the world think that would take you from being not to being something notable in the world? What is it that you could do that would impress the world? What would change that?
Think and act like them.
Act like them, okay? What else? What other choices could you make? How does the world measure impact? How does the measure world influence and power? Fame, wealth, yeah. Yeah, your name on a door somewhere in a corporation or something like that, closing the big deal, doing that kind of thing, working up in the corporate ladder, being tough, right? That's what the world would say. But the lesson I want to take from Archippus is this. The world's wrong about this. And that's what Paul's point is. The world is wrong about this. You are noticed and you are necessary. And not only that, you're seen and appreciated by God and also your brothers and sisters in Christ. You're not invisible. In fact, of your not, you're bringing to nothing the things that are. The things in that world which would look at you and say, unless you have some position in a corporate structure or you're somebody in some ladder, you bring to naught all of that. You bring to nothing all of it. Everybody who thinks those things. Archippus was a guy that had 17 words written to him in the New Testament, and it was basically to tell him, get to work. He lived and served in a community that, it was smaller than Cookeville. If you think sometimes maybe your work would be more noticed if you were in a bigger area, Archippus Colossae was smaller than Cookeville, and the congregation was one that fit in the house of Philemon. I'm kind of doubting it was 100 people. Philemon might have had a really big house, but it's kind of doubtful. Okay, he did all of that, and the world never noticed Archippus. He was low and despised like us. He was invisible like us, but the work that Archippus did was noticed by God. It was noticed, and it was important, and had more impact and more significance in God's eyes than what Nero did in his lifetime. And I want you to think about that. Ladies, the work that you do day by day has more impact in the kingdom of God than anything that President Trump will ever do in his life, President Obama ever did, President Biden ever did combined. Those men will not move the kingdom of God, but you do. As ladies in the kingdom, working quietly, doing your work as faithful women. You move the kingdom, they don't. But they'll get the headlines, and they'll have the history books written about them. But you know what's going to happen to those history books at the end? They're going to be burned up with everything else. But the words that are written about you in God's heart will last for eternity. You will last. Your works will last. But those people will not in doing that. Buddy?
We're so often not recognized that when we are noticed by brethren or spouses, it feels amazing.
Yeah, I think that that's a good point.
I try. I'm not trying to say, but if I notice Emily has done something, I'll let her know that I noticed.
It's an important point for us to make sure that we realize and recognize the work that's being done by all of us, but especially our ladies in the church. And I think that that's an important point as well. I want to relay to you a story, and then we're going to have a little bit more conversation during the rest of this. I apologize for more of the preachy lecture type right now. I just wanted to get this out. But there's a story that I wanted to tell you. Some of you have probably heard it over the years, but back when Jennifer was pregnant with Owen, our first child, We were living in Minnesota at the time for business. We still had a house here, but she was flying back from Minnesota basically about a month and a half before her due date. And I was going to stay there and drive back after. She was on the airplane, and she sat next to a lady on the airplane. And she relayed to me this conversation. The lady obviously noticed she was pregnant and started talking to her, when's your due date, things like that. And the lady asked, and it's kind of interesting the way that this was presented, but the lady asked her, she said, so how long are you going to take before you go back to work? And Jen said, oh, no, I'm a stay-at-home mom. And without thinking, I'm sure she didn't mean any harm by this, but without thinking, the lady responded and said, oh, I could never do that. I want to do something important with my life. You know why I'm seeing smiles on the ladies' faces around this auditorium? Because you know better than that, don't you? Because you look at it and go, important? You have no idea what's important. You have no idea what's been established and what has been successfully done through stay-at-home and through raising your children and taking care of the work of a household. You have no idea the impact difference. No matter how many sales deals that lady ever closes or how far the title is on the door that she serves, she will never have the impact on the world even, let alone the kingdom, that my wife has had in raising 5 children. Never. The impact is immeasurable on what it's done. And yet she will look at that and say, oh, I could never do that. I want to do something important with my life. She's believed a lie. She's believed the wisdom of the world, and the things that are nothing are brought to nothing by the actions of godly ladies. And that is just an amazing thing. So I think that's why we can smile as I look out. I see the lady smile and go, you don't get it. You don't get it because you've seen it. Because you see the wisdom of Paul and what he teaches here and what he says. Your role, ladies, shames the world. That's what Paul says. You shame the world and the wisdom of the world, and your work brings to nothing the work of the world. It makes it zero. What it thinks of you is what you actually end up achieving of it. Also from Jennifer, I have to give her credit for this entire section, as I do a lot of the things I teach, but I have to give her credit for this section. She was bringing up to me one time about her private studies in Peter, and she pointed out some scriptures to me I want to share with you, and I think it's really a beautiful picture. And it begins in 1 Peter chapter 1. In 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 19, the writing here is about Jesus. It's about Jesus and what his basically his status was before mankind. And the idea that Jesus was in fact abused, he was ignored, he was not recognized by the nation. And in verse 19, Paul refers to Jesus' blood, which was shed because of these things. He says, but with the precious blood of Christ, like that of a lamb without blemish or spot. He uses the word precious here. He uses the word precious to describe that sacrifice. In chapter 2, he goes on to describe Christ as the invisible, unknown, unrecognized Savior. But in the sight of God, he says in verse 4, as you come to him, a living stone rejected by men, but in the sight of God, chosen and precious. It's the second time. He uses the word throughout the book, but that's the second time he talks about it with Christ. Then, in 1 Peter 3, verses 3 and 4, and we're going to read this one. He's now talking to women. He's talking to faithful women, to godly women. And he says to them, do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair and the putting on of gold jewelry, or the clothing you wear, but let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is in God's sight is very precious. The measurement of the gentle and quiet spirit of a godly woman to God is precious. The same way that the blood of Christ is precious, the same way that the ignored and unrecognized Christ was precious. Don't downplay your value, ladies. Don't downplay it. The ladies in this congregation are adorned with imperishable beauty. I've seen it, you've seen it, we all see it. And it's beautiful, and it's amazing. And that's the way that we move in this congregation as a family, is every person doing their part. Don't devalue yourself in the kingdom. God sees you as precious. in doing that. Tom?
A lot of times we hear about equality between men and women in the world. But we don't have to worry about that. We are one family, and every single one of us is equal to the other in God's eyes.
Absolutely.
And in God's eyes, it matters anyway.
Absolutely. It's the only thing that matters. It's the only thing that matters. All right, let's let Archippus remind us of that, okay? So that ends my lecture. I appreciate your patience with me and being able to get that out and to express that. And we're going to move on and move into this other section as we go. All right, we're going to get back to Colossians 4:17 here as we look at the next piece of this. Notice what Paul says here. He says, fulfill the ministry that you received in the Lord. And I want to ask the question then, what is a ministry? What is a ministry? Rodney?
Something that you're doing.
Something you're doing. Okay, I would agree with that.
It's the idea of service. It's servanthood, or it's what we're expected to do, kind of like a slave would do. Ministry.
Yep.
Supposed to bring about.
Yeah, it's not just a work in the sense, specifically, it is a work, but it's a work of service. In other words, a work that is due from you. And so it's something you owe that has been placed upon you by ability or maybe situations, maybe circumstances, but it's a work that you're supposed to do. It's something you're supposed to do. A lot of times we reserve that word. We say, well, Rodney's the minister here. And he is. There's a sense in which he's a minister, but that's not something that's reserved for preachers or evangelists. The ministry is just simply that. It's a work of that. God entrusted Archippus, something that needed to be done. And he says, you need to fulfill your ministry that has been reserved in the Lord. Is that received in the Lord? I can't read my writing, it's too small. But you need to complete your ministry or to do that. So I'm going to ask the question of you then, what is your ministry? Not just the men. Now, I'm not asking about your title. I'm not asking about your office. I'm asking about your ministry on that, buddy.
That's a big part of it is the Great Commission.
Okay.
Make disciples.
Yep. There are ministries that are simply more general, right? But do you think that we have individual specific ministries to given by our own capabilities in our own place? Yeah, I would say this. We have 3 elders all represented here in the auditorium. Are all 3 of your ministries the same, would you say, because you have the exact same direction and background in life? No, I would say they're different, and which is what part of what makes God's plan for a congregation work very well. They all bring different ministries together to serve the congregation in the work that they do. That's part of it. So even within that, we see different ministries. So what is your ministry? Give me an example of what some Christian ministries are. What do you think?
Building up the household of faith.
Absolutely. It could be edification, right? A lot of different ways to do that. Edification, building up. What else? Benevolence, absolutely. Sometimes we've been blessed with a little bit more, or even sometimes out of our need, right? We saw the widow. We have different abilities to be benevolent to others in financial things, or sometimes maybe it's not financial. Sometimes we can be benevolent with our time. Time is money, right? Sometimes time costs more than money. I remember Ken Leach used to say, if you're trying to do work for others and you're trying to be benevolent to others and it's not inconvenient, you're doing it wrong. It needs to be a little inconvenient, or you're probably only giving of your excess, the things you want to give. And I think that there's truth to that on that. Rich?
Hospitality.
Oh, absolutely. Hospitality is a big one. Being able to open your homes, as we mentioned before, and do that. What else? Dan? Yeah, teaching? Okay, absolutely. It may be that. It may be in front. It may be somewhere else. Absolutely. Teaching takes all kinds of forms, Darlene.
But I was thinking training children to
Oh.
know God and follow Him.
That is directly on track. I think that she was saying training up children to follow God and preparing the next generation and the kingdom workers. I think that's absolutely a ministry that's given to many people, men and women alike. Absolutely. Buddy?
I don't know if this falls under time, but running a chainsaw with for somebody.
Maybe benevolence of time in that way. Yeah, sometimes it takes an odd shape that we don't always think of in doing that. You know what's really cool, though, of all the things you just mentioned, and I know there's a lot more in your mind probably, You know what's really cool about it is, isn't it neat when you see in a congregation, and I see it here, and I know you do too, when you see people fulfilling their ministry in a congregation? Isn't it neat? I know about people sometimes. Some of you, I know. I watch you. I know you. I see the works you do sometimes that are kind of behind the scene, and you think it's more private, but I find out about it. It's encouraging. I see that work. I see that ministry that you fulfill. Sometimes it's a card. Sometimes it's a word or a call. Sometimes it's a visit or something like that. I see it. And that's an amazing thing to see happening, and it's very encouraging to do that. So I would encourage you from this lesson is to find your ministry. Maybe pray about what your ministry is. We can do a lot of things for God. He didn't say, fulfill a ministry. He said, fulfill the ministry that you receive from the Lord. Archippus had a job to do, and he clearly knew what it was. Find your job. Find out what it is that you do. It may not be what you want to do necessarily, but it's something you're good at doing. And fulfill that ministry and do it. So commit to do that and to see how important you are in the kingdom. Okay, so let's focus on something else to do with him. Let's switch over to Philemon. It's 9:30 and we're already to our second verse. I mean, we're halfway through, right? All right, rereading here. To Philemon, our beloved fellow worker, and Apphia, our sister, and Archippus, our fellow soldier, and the church in your house. Okay, so what do you think about this? What do you think when he refers to Archippus? Oh, go ahead.
Done with the other verses in general?
Oh, we don't have to.
Well, just one real quick thing. One thing that I think is really interesting about, I think the message of our quest is just like prayer for this and all the things that aren't said, in this verse. Because there are so many, right?
There are many.
Exactly, it's that ministry, those good things. But the thing that's stuck out to me the most, like even just this morning looking at some things, is the fact that, what was the obstacles? See that you fulfill it. And I think that the biggest part to me in that is the fact that we don't know what obstacles there were. Maybe they're big, maybe they're small, maybe they're all kinds of things.
Yeah, it may have been Archippus, but it could have been outside.
And it's not in the text because it doesn't matter.
It may have been a reminder, but it could have been just an encouragement. Keep going. Fulfill it. A good start is great, but a good finish is better. Maybe fulfill it. I agree with you. There's a lot not said that has lessons in it like that.
I think that's kind of neat for us is that the truth is it didn't matter with inspiration. It didn't matter what the obstacles were.
No,
The statement is still the same. Fulfill the ministry.
it is. It is. Very, very good point. Okay, so we're back to Philemon and looking at that. And he says he calls him, obviously the lesson here is, or part of it is, a fellow soldier. And so tell me, what does that put you in mind of? What do you think this is? What does it imply about him? Tom?
Defense of the gospel.
Okay.
As we're told, put on the whole armor of God. And there is a list of things. Every single one of those is defensive except the word of God, which is the
Except
sword.
that. Yep. Absolutely. And it tones battle, doesn't it, in a battlefield. Buddy?
I may have missed this, but the letter is to Philemon and Apphia and Archippus. It's not, I mean, and then it starts talking about more to Philemon, but the letter is to all of them. And the next verse, grace to you and peace from God our Father. I think of you always and remember the prayer because I hear your love, and so that's what we know about Archippus. He's got love, he's got faith for Jesus and all the saints.
Yeah.
There's a lot there.
It's very positive, isn't it? And his involvement is very clear as well. But a soldier has certain intonation to it, doesn't it? That defense, that battlefield that takes place. It's war, it's enemy. And it isn't a coincidence. You notice Philemon, he calls him a beloved fellow worker. That's a different word. He calls Archippus a soldier. He calls Philemon a worker. And both of them are Christians, but he has different titles for them. Robert?
I thought it's interesting that the word used for fellow soldier here in the Greek, it's in the context of Philemon and, I can't come up with, there's one other person that Paul uses term for in the New Testament, but it means figuratively an associate Christian toil, but Plato used this in Greek as a co-campaigner.
Okay, yeah.
Somebody who
Yeah.
toils with one another and is side by side.
Yes. Paul saw it as he didn't just call him a fellow soldier to everyone. He was calling him a fellow soldier to him. And I think that's important. We're going to bring that up. That's a really good observation, Robert, that it is a little bit different from just a general fellow soldier in doing that. I want to read next from Ephesians 6 and verse 12. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against spiritual forces of evil in heavenly places. Did you ever think about the idea that your ministry, whatever that is, ladies, you're included in this, that your ministry, where does that battlefield take place that you do in your ministry? Because you are fellow soldiers. As Tom pointed out, you wear the armor of God. Where does that ministry, where does that battlefield, where does it exist? He says, we don't war against flesh and blood, right? It's not here, right? We don't see it here, but where do you fight? Spiritual places. And he says you fight against cosmic powers over the present darkness. You know, you'd almost look at that and say, you know what, I wish our fight was here. Because who I'm battling are cosmic forces of evil in dark and spiritual places. That sounds serious, folks. Don't diminish the work that you're doing in your ministry. Doing the things that we've listed today are battle in those places. God has created in you someone capable of doing battle on those levels and has turned you loose in the world and said, that's mine. Watch what he or she does. And here's what happens. You're toppling powers and kingdoms and spiritual beings and cosmic forces in dark places, and you're doing it every day. And you're doing it through the power of God in that. Macy?
To that point, I've kind of been thinking that like one of my passions in motherhood is to really get to know your kids to the point where you can speak their ministry over them, like to identify what is it about you, what's special about you, so that I can speak that over you and you can walk in it when you're, when you're grown. And I feel like in the congregation that we have a place to do that for other people, like when you see them really honing in on what is good, what they're good at.
Absolutely. I think that's something that we've tried to do is when they have a talent, you associate it with how can you use that to serve God? Like that's an amazing talent, guys, and how can you do that? Tom?
As a soldier, they are supposed to be ready, on call for duty, the things that their commander wants them to do. They have to be ready at all times. And a lot of that won't depend on our physical eyes as much as what we understand of our heart is going on and what needs to be addressed.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, we've got to keep our eyes off of the battle of this world and remember that the battlefield that we're fighting on is spiritual. And remember that because in this world, physically it's broken and we're going to experience physical things and grief and pain and loss, but that does not mean we're losing. In fact, we're going to talk about this. Rodney's lesson last week told us very clearly that probably means you're winning. It probably means you're winning because glorification comes through suffering. Absolutely. So he didn't just say that Archippus was a soldier. What did he describe him as? What kind of soldier? His fellow soldier. And as Robert pointed out in that, and I think this is important to point out, he said Archippus was a fellow soldier. And I wanted to point this part out too, is that we were not intended to be soldiers alone. We're not intended to be soldiers alone on a battlefield. We were called together for a purpose. The reason we're here this morning is not because us in our wisdom decided to find other like-minded people. It's because God told us to find like-minded people, come together and do what he's given us to do. And I wanted to ask you one other question as we go through this. Figure this from these source texts again. There's 2 letters that were written. They were written at the same time. They're delivered at the same time. There were 3 actually came together, but Ephesians was going to be delivered to Ephesus. Tychicus carried the 3 letters. He brought Onesimus with him. Philemon and Colossians were delivered together. One is a private letter to Philemon, right? It's written to him. It's given to him. We still have it recorded for us, but it was given specifically to Philemon, and he would have read it. In that letter, he greets Archippus. He says, Archippus, a fellow soldier. But the letter that would be read in public at the congregation at Colossae, he puts in there and says, say to Archippus, fulfill your ministry. Why do you think he pulled out the fulfilling of the ministry to say to Archippus? You can see the reader in the congregation going, oh, is Archippus here? Okay, Paul says this in front of the congregation. Why do you think that is? A possibility. Obviously, we don't know exactly. Danny?
There's a way in which that can help, right?
Okay.
In the sense of people in Colossae, you can either encourage in some of this or help, whether it needs to be, kicking the pants a little bit, or if
Maybe.
it needs to be just an encouragement, hey, this is hard, we got back, kind of thing. But there's a way that people can help.
Yeah.
With the ministry.
Rich, and then Buddy?
I would say to read it in front of the congregation also points out to them, don't be a stumbling block for him in his ministry. Help him
Good point.
fulfill it.
Good point. Maybe an encouragement in that way. Okay, Buddy?
I don't want to say promotion, but like letting the congregation know that his position is different than theirs.
Okay.
Like,
Recognize the work he has to do.
He's actually a fellow, like, he's moved up to that position.
Okay, maybe recognition of some of that. Okay. What about the word I thought of when I thought of this, which is hitting on every one of these points, is accountability. I think it has a lot to do with accountability. The church is designed and functions around the concept of accountability. We recognize that, right? We know that the whole point of me being here to some extent is for you to hold me accountable. And if I start slipping, if you love me, you will come to me and tell me. Some of you over the past 30-something years I've been here have done that. And I appreciate it because I needed it. And I promise to do the same for you. And if we won't do that, how useful is this congregation to one another? If we just go on acting like everything is fine when it's not, accountability is important. And I don't know that that's the reason, but I think it's important to note that Paul chose to put that part in the public letter. And he could have just as easily put it right there when he greeted Archippus in the Philemon letter. And I think that that's worthy of being pointed out and doing that. Scriptures to do with that, James 5:16. Therefore confess your sins to one another, pray for one another that you may be healed. And the prayer of a righteous man is great power as it is working. And iron sharpens iron as man sharpens, and one man sharpens another. We know that these things are true in that. One last point, we've got a couple minutes left here. One last point that I wanted to bring up about all this, and that is I'm going to go outside of the scriptures that we've been covering as our source scripture, just a verse here. In chapter 4, verse 17 of Colossians, and say to Archippus, see that you fulfill the ministry that you've received in the Lord. The very verse after that, the final verse in the chapter says, I, Paul, write this greeting with my own hand. Remember my chains. Grace be with you. I think that it's impactful, and one of the things that I wanted to point out about this as we finish up our lesson in this, I don't think it was accidental. I don't think it was an afterthought. I think Paul put in there, when he was talking about all these things, and he brings to Archippus to fulfill that ministry, he says, remember my chains. Remember my chains. I don't think that that's random. I think when Paul is pointing this out, and this goes back to Rodney's lesson from last Sunday, and that is the idea that ministries almost always are connected to some extent to suffering. Ministries often are brought about by suffering. They're brought about by chains. And when we look at our ministries and the things that we have to do, a lot of times serving one another is brought about by pain in some point. It's a lack. There's a grief. There's a hole. There's something that's given that needs to be ministered to. And a lot of times those come out of the idea of chains. We have, in this congregation, have been given a ministry, generally speaking. We have a ministry that has to do with comfort. I'm going to put this verse up here. We don't have time to read it right now. 2 Corinthians 1, read it afterwards. Paul makes the point and says, the suffering that we suffer is the suffering that Christ suffered. And because we were comforted after Christ, because we suffered, we get to comfort you. And now you, because of your suffering, get to comfort others. That's the gift that suffering gives you, because only you can understand the suffering of others at the level that you yourselves have suffered. And this congregation has gone through and been reminded of that just recently. We have lost husbands, we've lost wives, we've lost sisters, we've lost children, grandchildren. We've lost many things over the years. And in all of those things, we've been given also a ministry. And it's a ministry to remember our chains and remember that ministry that's given to you of comfort. And you know what the problem with that is, though, and what you're going to realize as you go through life? And y'all who have gone through the losses, and all of us together who have gone through these losses, when someone else needs that help and you go to them to minister them, it hurts. I'm going to tell you right now, it hurts. It still hurts. But it's a comfort you can give, that's something that God gave you that is unique to you and that you can then bestow upon others. This congregation is strong at dealing with that ministry. We've been given that. It's unfortunate in some ways because it's not easy to be given that. But I want to encourage you to remember and fulfill your ministry. Remember your chains and why we do it and why it's so important, because loss is not going to go away. Brokenness in this world is not going to be solved until after this world is over. So remember your chains, fulfill your ministry in the Lord. Thank you guys so much. I appreciate your patience and your participation.